In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion of some of the more complex aspects of classical conditioning. In particular, we'll be talking about specificity in classical conditioning. Why is it that we condition to certain stimuli and not to others? Simply because a neutral stimulus is paired with an unconditioned stimulus does not guarantee that that neutral stimulus will become a conditioned stimulus and that will develop a conditioned response to it. So first, we'll discuss the compound stimulus. This is the simultaneous presentation of two or more individual stimuli. So looking at this picture, take, for example, if you were to trip and fall in front of your classmates. Tripping and falling would be an unconditioned stimulus that leads to the unconditioned response of feeling embarrassment. And then because your classmates were paired with the unconditioned stimulus of you tripping and falling, you develop a conditioned response of embarrassment when presented with your classmates. Your classmates would be a compound stimulus because it's the presentation of two or more stimuli at the same time. So because your classmates are made up of lots of individuals, they will be a compound stimulus. In our last lecture, we talked about your bully, his clothing, his backpack, and his associates. Those would all come to make a compound stimulus because it's made up of lots of individual stimuli that are presented at the same time. Overshadowing deals with a compound stimulus. With overshadowing, the more salient member of a compound stimulus is more readily conditioned as the CS and thereby interferes with the conditioning of the less salient members. So this is saying that when you develop a conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus that is a compound stimulus, you are more likely to develop that conditioned response in reaction to the most salient member of that compound stimulus. So the member of that compound stimulus that is your conditioned stimulus, that stands out the most, that's the most salient, that is the part that you're most likely to condition to. So going back to our example of the middle school bully. If your middle school bully wears a cowboy jersey, wears a stud earring, wears Skechers tennis shoes, and you develop a fear response to that bully in his clothing, you are more likely to have a fear response to the Cowboys jersey because it is the most salient part of that compound stimulus. It is a part of that compound stimulus that stands out the most, so you're more likely to condition to that part of the compound stimulus. If you like the songs released by a musical group, you associate the group with the songs, you are most likely to have the stronger, more positive response to the lead singer of that group because the lead singer will be the most salient part of that compound stimulus. So the songs would be the unconditioned stimulus that you have the automatic reaction to. You associate it with the group that's a neutral stimulus. That group, because it's associated with the songs, becomes a conditioned stimulus. That conditioned stimulus of the group is a compound stimulus, and you're most likely to have the conditioned response of positive feelings to the lead singer of that group, to the most salient member of that compound stimulus. So the most salient part of the compound stimulus tends to overshadow the other elements of that compound stimulus, and the most salient part is the part that you're most likely to develop the conditioned response to. Blocking also deals with a compound stimulus. With blocking, the presence of an established stimulus interferes with the conditioning of a new conditioned stimulus. So this is the idea of if you already have a conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus, if that conditioned stimulus then becomes a part of a compound stimulus, you don't tend to have a conditioned response to the newly added part of the stimulus. So with the middle school bully example, if the middle school bully always wears a cowboy jersey, as a result, you associate the jersey with being beaten up, and so you have a conditioned fear response to the jersey. If that bully then begins wearing a stud earring, so now that is the stud earring is a part of the compound stimulus. You are unlikely to develop a fear response to the stud by itself. So you already have the fear response to the jersey, the earrings added to the compound stimulus. You are unlikely to develop a fear response to the earring. In a laboratory example, if a light is paired with a shock and eventually a dog develops a fear response to the light, then you pair the light with the tone and present the light, the tone, and the shock together. The dog is unlikely to develop a fear response to the tone alone, even though the tone is presented with the shock along with the light. And the reason for blocking is, or the reason we think blocking occurs is, remember, the conditioned stimulus, the function of the conditioned stimulus is to predict the presence of the unconditioned stimulus. So in the first example, if the Cowboys jersey, the conditioned stimulus, already accurately predicts the presence of being beaten up, the stud earring does not add any new information. So we can already predict that being beaten up will follow seeing the Cowboys jersey. The fact that the bully is now wearing a stud earring, there's no reason to pay attention to the stud earring because it's not giving us any additional information. With the example of the dog and the light, if the light already accurately predicts the presence of the shock, the fact that the light and the tone are now being presented with the shock, the tone is not telling me anything that I don't already know. So the tone is not telling the dog anything else to expect. The light already accurately predicts the presentation of the shock. Now, with occasion setting, a stimulus that's referred to as an occasion setter signals whether a conditioned stimulus is likely to be followed by an unconditioned stimulus. And so because the occasion setter lets us know whether the CS is likely to be followed by the US, it controls whether the conditioned stimulus will elicit a conditioned response. So when the occasion setter is present, the conditioned stimulus will elicit the conditioned response. When the occasion setter is not present, the conditioned stimulus will not elicit the conditioned response. So, for example, let's say that outside your home you have fire ants, they bite and they cause you to feel fear. But inside your home you have a different, let's say, totally harmless type of sugar ant and they don't bite. And so when you're inside, you see an ant, you know the ant will not bite, so you don't feel fear. When you're outside, you predict that the neutral stimulus of the ant will be followed by the unconditioned stimulus of the bite, so you feel fear. So outside serves as an occasion setter. When you're outside, it lets you know that the neutral stimulus of the ant will be followed by the unconditioned stimulus of the bite, so you feel fear. So when outside, an ant becomes a conditioned stimulus that causes fear. When inside, you predict that the ant will not be followed by a bite. So when you're inside, the ant does not become a conditioned stimulus. It does not cause you to feel fear because you do not predict that a bite will follow. So, going back to how to make sense of all this, the idea is that simply because a neutral stimulus is presented does not mean that you will develop some type of conditioned response to it. Here, the occasion, whether you're outside or inside, lets you know whether or not you should show that conditioned response of fear when you see an ant. And lastly, we'll discuss latent inhibition. So think about, are you most likely to condition to a familiar stimulus or an unfamiliar stimulus? And we typically condition most readily to unfamiliar stimuli, to things that we are not consistently exposed to. So this prevents the development of a conditioned response or a conditioned association to redundant stimuli in the environment. So let's take this example. Let's say that you walk down the same street every day. So you see the same surroundings, you see the same houses, the same trees, the same people. And one day you see an unfamiliar car sitting on the corner. Somebody jumps out and robs you. Are you most likely to feel fear associated with those things with which you're familiar, the houses, the people, the trees you see every day on your walk? Or do you condition your fear to that unfamiliar car? And you're most likely to condition your fear to the unfamiliar car, to the unfamiliar part of your environment, to the novel or the unfamiliar stimulus. So again, this prevents us from developing conditioned associations to redundant parts of our environment, to things that we see over and over. We tend to condition to the unfamiliar stimuli. And people with schizophrenia tend to have problems with latent inhibition. They tend to more readily condition to familiar aspects of their environment. So an example of this would be, let's say a person with schizophrenia is in a building that they've been in many times, and then somebody comes in and beats them up. So most of us, if we have no issues with latent inhibition, we're most likely to develop a fear of that unfamiliar person, that novel part of our environment. A person with schizophrenia who does have problems with latent inhibition might develop a fear of the building or the tile on the floor or the windows in the building. So even though that person has seen those things time and time again, and those things have not predicted being beaten up, that person will associate that with being beaten up rather than the unfamiliar person. So they tend to make these sort of inaccurate associations between things in their environment. Most of us would habituate to the familiar things and we would develop the fear to the unfamiliar stimulus. Here, this person is associating something with the things that they're familiar with as opposed to the unfamiliar stimulus in their environment. So again, all of these concepts illustrate that we have specificity in our conditioning. We can condition to certain stimuli and not to others, even though those stimuli can be associated with the unconditioned stimulus. Will develop a conditioned response to certain stimuli and not to others.